Hello, I'm Matthew Zollinger, and this is my project about book publication in Africa. Um, this is specifically looking at books published in a year in different African countries and comparing different countries and why there might be big differences in the number of books published. So I wanted to start out by showing you this map. Um, this shows that Egypt, for example, publishes 9,000 books a year, which is a pretty decent number, especially for Africa. South Africa, Morocco, Algeria, Nigeria, those are also big book publishers in Africa. Where you don't see a country where it's just white, that's because those countries just didn't report their statistics. It's not because they're not publishing books necessarily. And so statistics are actually pretty sparse and sometimes outdated. That's a little bit unfortunate. But this data is still pretty reflective of the situation in African countries today. This is gross domestic product per capita compared to the number of books published in a year. I've removed the top 5 gross domestic product countries simply because it makes the graph hard to read. They generally do reflect the trend that you see here, which is, of course, that an increase in GDP per capita leads to more books published per year, or rather that there's a correlation. That makes sense. It's about what I expected, except that I kind of expected this trend to be stronger. There is still a correlation here, which makes sense intuitively that you spend money on, when money's limited, you don't spend it as much on books. But I did expect this trend to be a little bit stronger. One thing that I really found interesting, though, was colonialism and its influence on publishing. Publishing, or books, did exist before colonialism, as evidenced by the library in Timbuktu, but really printing presses were introduced to Africa due to colonialism, especially due to Christian influence and missionary efforts. The Bible, the Pilgrim's Progress, almanacs, grammar texts, catechisms were all printed on printing presses in Africa. And there were even translations into indigenous African languages, which I found really interesting. There's a translation of the Setswana New Testament, which was finished in 1840, which is a lot earlier than I would have expected. Just as a side note, there was censorship of African writers a little bit later on when they were still being published by these missionary or these mission-owned printing presses, simply so that they would align with Christianity. So that is an unfortunate thing about early modern African literature. There were also regional differences between how colonialism affected different regions. For example, in Egypt, the printing press was introduced with Napoleon's expedition into Egypt. And further, when the British had colonized Egypt, they wanted a book every 6 hours produced there, simply because it would boost the economy of Egypt. West Africa had a lot of freed slaves, former slaves from America, and Britain moved to Sierra Leone and Liberia, which gave them an early jump on literature and literature production. The Translation Bureau in Nigeria started running contests as well during late colonial times, and the government has continued to really support books and book publication, and that's why it's so big in Nigeria. East and Central Africa didn't get missionaries as fast as a lot of the other regions of Africa, and their recent incidents of violent conflict has led to slowdown in that region. Southern Africa had a really interesting program called the House of Students of the Empire, where Portuguese colonies would take indigenous people and educate them. And when they returned to their home countries, they also got a big head start on book publication, literary tradition. I really enjoyed this project. It was really enlightening to me to see how different literary traditions have developed.